Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a really deceptively simple source document today.
Yeah, it really
It's
is.
a blog entry dated May 7, 2026, and it's from a series titled Notes on Dieting,
Hmm.
specifically Part 113. Is written by an author named Ang.
Right.
And our mission today is to explore how this one tiny, completely overlooked item on a standard grocery run can basically unlock this massive world of sensory, botanical, and, culinary fascination.
I love this piece because it starts with such a relatable premise.
Oh, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
to start, I just want you, the listener, to picture this. You know that exact feeling when you're at your local grocery store and you are just entirely on autopilot.
Oh, yeah, the Tuesday night run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're in the produce section, you're dodging shopping carts, the fluorescent lights are humming overhead, and you are just blindly walking past literal mountains of fruits and vegetables that you have seen, 1,000 times before.
Well, biologically speaking, we build these incredibly efficient mental maps of routine environments like a supermarket.
Right.
The human brain simply cannot afford the cognitive load of consciously processing every single apple or cabbage or root vegetable you walk past.
It would be exhausting.
Exactly. So we filter all that visual noise out just to conserve mental energy.
We filter it out until suddenly the system glitches.
Hmm.
You know, you stop, you look down, and you really truly look at something for the first time.
Yes, the pattern breaks.
And you realize you have absolutely no idea what this thing is, even though it has been sitting in that exact same spot, in that exact same aisle, every week for the last 5 years.
Which is exactly what happens to Aang in this blog post.
Yes, that universal aha moment.
Yeah.
Aang spots this vegetable,
Correct.
completely admits to having walked past it countless times, but finally stops to look at it. And at first glance, Aang assumes it's a lotus bud.
Which makes sense visually. A closed lotus bud has a very distinct, tightly overlapping teardrop kind of shape.
Right, it's very recognizable.
And if you're rushing through a market, your brain relies heavily on pattern recognition. It sees a pinkish, layered, pointed bulb and just immediately categorizes it as a lotus bud because, well, that's a familiar visual template.
But then Aang actually reads the label. And it's not a lotus bud at all.
Not even close.
The label says it's Bunga Kantan, which Aang looks up and discovers is the torch ginger flower, or, botanically, Etlingera elatior.
Yes.
And I just love this realization. It feels like seeing someone in line for coffee wearing baggy sweatpants and sunglasses, and you just assume it's your neighbor.
Right.
But then they take off the glasses, you realize you're standing next to this massive A-list celebrity. Like, this plant disguises itself as this humble, decorative lotus bud, but it's actually this huge culinary powerhouse.
It really is an A-lister in the kitchen.
Yeah.
The torch ginger flower is widely considered one of the most iconic aromatic ingredients in all of Southeast Asian cooking.
But here is where I kind of have to push back on Aang's premise for a second.
Oh. How so?
Well, Aang reads up on this flower and learns that its scent profile is described as this incredibly unique, potent mix of citrus, ginger, and herbs.
A very strong profile, yeah.
Right. And it's a staple ingredient in famously robust dishes like Asam Laksa and nasi ulam, which, by the way, is also sometimes called nasi kelabu.
Yes, very famous dishes.
But Aang openly admits to having eaten these exact dishes before, multiple times, but cannot recall the specific presence of this torch ginger flower in those meals.
Right, Aang didn't notice it.
Which, I struggle to understand how that is biologically possible. If something has an aggressive, pungent mix of citrus and ginger, human biology is wired to notice those volatile compounds.
You'd think so, yeah.
How do you consume a culinary celebrity in famous dishes and just completely miss his presence?
Well, what's fascinating here is that to understand that, you have to look at how the human palate actually processes extreme culinary complexity,
Okay, break that down for me.
especially in the architecture of Southeast Asian cuisine. When you look at a dish like Asam Laksa, you are not dealing with subtle, isolated flavors.
Definitely not subtle.
No. You are looking at a masterpiece of overwhelming competing extremes. You have the deep, heavy umami of the fish broth.
Right.
You have intense chili heat. You have the sharp, pungent sourness of tamarind. And then the really aggressive funk of fermented shrimp paste.
It's a loud dish.
Yeah.
It is essentially screaming at your taste buds from every possible direction.
Exactly. And when a dish is playing at maximum sensory volume like that, the introduction of the torched ginger flower does not act as a soloist demanding attention.
Oh, interesting.
It functions as a structural pillar. So those citrus notes in the flower chemically lock in with the tamarind to elevate and brighten the sourness so it doesn't become flat.
Okay, I see.
And the ginger notes harmonize with the fish broth to kind of cut through that heavy funkiness of the shrimp paste, keeping the whole broth vibrant. And then the herbal notes provide this necessary bridge between the heavy umami base and the fresh garnishes on top.
So it isn't the lead singer. It's like the bass line holding the entire song together.
That's a perfect analogy. It blends so seamlessly into the background architecture of the dish that a consumer just wouldn't mentally isolate it.
That makes so much sense.
You experience the magic of the whole, but your brain doesn't bother to identify the specific structural pillars holding it up.
Right, you just know the song sounds good.
Exactly. And that is why Aang could eat it for years and be entirely unaware. It is doing its job perfectly by integrating, not by standing out.
And Aang actually mentions, with this really refreshing dose of humor, that despite learning all this amazing culinary background right there in the grocery aisle, they didn't even stop to smell the flower.
I know, that part is great.
Aang just basically resolves to smell it next time. It's such a wonderfully human reaction. Like, you uncover this massive secret about your food, but, you still have to get home before the frozen peas melt in your cart.
Right. It highlights this profound disconnect we often have as modern consumers between the raw ingredient and the final product.
Totally.
We're so accustomed to consuming the finished culinary masterpiece that confronting the raw materials in their natural state, it requires a deliberate shift in our cognitive processing.
A shift we just don't always have the time for on a random Tuesday afternoon.
Exactly.
And that everyday Tuesday afternoon context actually brings us to the economics of this flour, which completely blew my mind.
Yeah, the pricing is revealing.
Because when I hear about an ingredient that possesses this complex three-part flavor profile and serves as the structural baseline for an entire region's most famous dishes, my mind just automatically defaults to luxury.
Sure, you think of high-end dining.
Right. I assume we are talking about the culinary equivalent of truffles or saffron, something rare, expensive, and really difficult to procure. But Aang notes the price right there in the blog entry.
It's shockingly low.
The torched ginger flower costs around 3.65 Malaysian ringgit per piece.
Which, depending on the current exchange rate, is roughly $1 or less in U.S. currency.
$1. Aang explicitly points out how accessible it is as an everyday ingredient. And I feel like that completely upends the Western concept of what makes an ingredient iconic.
It really does challenge that notion.
It's like finding a secret cheat code for high-end, complex flavor and discovering it's just sitting right there in the bargain produce bin. It's the ultimate affordable luxury.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we often conflate monetary price with cultural value in the West. But culinary history tells a very different story.
How so?
Everyday accessibility is precisely the mechanism that allows an ingredient to become iconic in the first place. For something to act as a foundational staple in regional daily diets, it fundamentally cannot be a rare luxury.
Well, yeah, because if it costs $50 an ounce, you are only eating it on your anniversary.
Right.
It never actually gets the chance to weave itself into your daily cultural identity.
Exactly. A true staple must be democratic. It has to be biologically robust, reliably available, and cheap enough for the working class to utilize it without hesitation.
That makes total sense.
The torched ginger flower is iconic because its low cost allowed generations of home cooks, grandmothers, and street food vendors to experiment with it daily.
They could afford to mess up a recipe.
Yes, they could afford to fail with it, learn its nuances, and eventually weave that complex citrus ginger herb profile deeply into the culinary DNA of the region.
Wow.
Truffles and saffron are events. The torched ginger flower is sustenance. And that represents a much deeper, more ingrained kind of cultural importance.
The difference between an occasional event and an ingrained identity. I love that. And honestly, that low price point and everyday accessibility actually explains the next major leap in Aang's thought process.
The pivot to gardening.
Yes. Because the flower isn't some precious, untouchable luxury. It sort of demystifies the plant.
Yeah.
Aang goes from wondering how it tastes to immediately wanting to produce it. The blog takes this sharp pivot straight into botany.
Right. Aang does a quick online search and discovers what the plant actually looks like when it's fully in bloom.
And finds photos revealing that the full bloomed flower is massive. Aang describes it as resembling a giant chrysanthemum.
It's a very striking plant.
It is. And the very next sentence in the blog is this hilarious confession. Aang writes, I seriously need to stop thinking about propagation every time I spot a plant or a fish.
It's a great moment of self-reflection.
It is, but I
Yeah.
actually have to challenge whether this is a universal human instinct. Like,
hmm
is the desire to cultivate truly an inherent human trait, or is Aang just, an obsessive hobbyist?
Well, we do live in a modern era.
Right, we live in an era of unparalleled convenience. We have grocery stores precisely so we do not have to farm. Most people do not look at an 80-cent flower bud and immediately start drafting architectural plans for a backyard greenhouse.
That's true. Not everyone acts on it. But the underlying psychological shift from consumer to producer is actually deeply embedded in our evolutionary history.
Wait, really? How deep?
Very deep. When we discover something novel in our environment, especially something that offers immense sensory value like a complex fragrance or a foundational flavor, our primal instinct is not just to experience it transiently.
Okay.
Our instinct is to secure a continuous controlled supply.
So we want to own the magic trick rather than just constantly buying tickets to the show.
Exactly. Propagation represents agency over our environment. Aang doesn't want to remain dependent on the grocery store supply chain for this torch ginger flower.
Right?
By contemplating cultivation, Aang is exploring how to bring that botanical magic directly into the domestic sphere.
And Aang actually outlines the botanical mechanics of how you would do that, noting that Etlingera elatior is a member of the ginger family.
Yes, the Zingiberacea family.
Right. And according to the research Aang pulled, you can grow it using seeds or little plantlets that offshoot from the flowers. But the absolute best way is through rhizome division.
Which is a fascinating process.
It really is. I am fascinated by the concept of rhizomes. It sounds like straight-up sci-fi cloning. You just break off a chunk of an underground stem, bury it in the dirt, and it spawns this massive, giant chrysanthemum-like structure.
The biology of the ginger family is an evolutionary marvel, honestly, and rhizomes are the absolute key to their resilience.
So what exactly is a rhizome, then? Because it just looks like a root to me.
People often mistake them for roots, but they are entirely different structures. Rhizomes are essentially modified subterranean stems.
Okay, so a stem that grows underground.
Yes, they grow horizontally underground, sending out stabilizing roots downward, and then new green shoots upward from distinct points called nodes.
So it's essentially the plant's underground hard drive,
Mm.
like a biological server storing all the genetic code and the energy it needs to just copy and paste itself endlessly.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism. Because a rhizome acts as a massive storage organ for starches and essential proteins, a severed piece contains all the built-in fuel necessary to survive the severe trauma of being divided.
Oh, wow. So it brings its own packed lunch.
Basically, yes. It doesn't need to start from scratch like a fragile seed does. It uses its stored energy reserves to establish completely new, independent plant system almost immediately.
Which explains why Aang notes it's the best way to propagate it. I mean, seeds take forever and have terrible survival rates.
Exactly.
And plantlets probably need highly specific environmental triggers to take root. But rhizome division is basically plug-and-play biology.
It is incredibly robust and highly reliable, which perfectly aligns with the needs of a home grower who is looking for a successful domestic project.
And that concept of a domestic project actually brings this entire journey full circle in the most unexpected way.
It really does.
Because we have spent all this time talking about sensory masking in complex broths and the democratic economics of street food and the evolutionary marvel of rhizomes.
Right.
But we have to remember the overarching context of this entire document. The title of the blog post is literally Notes on Dieting Part 113.
Yes, we can't forget that.
This is not a botanical journal. It's a daily log about managing diet and home life.
And the conclusion of Aang's entry anchors all of this high-flying discovery firmly back into the practical reality of a shared domestic routine.
Yeah, so Aang writes that because the current focus of the blog is dieting, the immediate curiosity is how to utilize this fragrant local ingredient in their own daily home cooking.
Makes sense.
And Aang specifically mentions needing to discuss this potential new addition with their significant other, their SO,
Right.
which feels to me like the ultimate domestic test. I mean, it is one thing to admire a giant flower online or appreciate its role in a famous bowl of Asam Laksa you bought at a stall.
Sure.
It is an entirely different negotiation to pitch a highly pungent, unfamiliar ingredient to your partner and suggest fundamentally altering your daily dietary habits.
Oh, absolutely. It requires navigating shared domestic space, shared budgets, and most importantly, shared culinary comfort zones.
Exactly. And it also completely reframes our standard cultural definition of the word
What do
dieting.
you mean?
Well, when you see a title like Notes on Dieting Part 113, the modern expectation is a log of misery.
Oh, yeah. Calorie counting.
Right. You expect to read about aggressive calorie counting or eliminating carbohydrates or the soul-crushing routine of eating plain steamed chicken breast every night.
It's usually about what you can't have.
Dieting is almost universally synonymous with restriction, with making your culinary world smaller and sadder. But Eng's approach here is the exact opposite. Eng views dieting as a mandate for adventurous addition.
This raises an important question regarding the psychology of sustained dietary changes,
Yeah.
because the vast majority of restrictive diets fail. And they fail because subtraction inevitably leads to severe psychological and sensory fatigue.
You just get bored.
Exactly. It triggers the exact same phenomenon we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Yeah.
Your brain gets bored and it just checks out.
Right.
If your daily diet is defined solely by the removal of joy, eating transforms from a pleasure into a daily chore.
It becomes a punishment you literally have to endure 3 times a day.
Yes. But look at the framework Eng is building here. By focusing on discovering, analyzing, and incorporating exciting, highly aromatic, and incredibly affordable local ingredients like Etlingera elatior, the concept of the diet undergoes a radical transformation.
It stops being a solitary punishment.
Exactly. It becomes a shared household exploration. Eng is not turning to the significant other and saying, we have to eat less food starting tomorrow.
Right.
Eng is saying, look at this incredibly complex citrus ginger herb structural pillar I found at the market for 3 ringgits. Let's figure out how to experiment with this in our kitchen.
It is gamifying the entire concept of eating healthy. It turns a boring Tuesday night dinner into a culinary laboratory experiment.
It does.
Suddenly, the focus shifts completely away from the foods you are giving up and centers entirely on the thrill of the novelty you are introducing.
It brilliantly leverages positive psychological reinforcement. Think about it. The sensory engagement of tracking down the torch ginger flower, the intellectual stimulation of learning about its rhizome propagation, and the social engagement of collaborating on a new recipe with a partner.
It's a whole event.
Right. All of these elements build a highly resilient psychological framework. It makes the difficult process of changing daily habits feel like an expanding adventure rather than a shrinking sacrifice.
It is a brilliant approach to take an utterly mundane autopilot grocery run and turn it into a masterclass on how to keep your life, your relationship, and your diet deeply interesting.
It's a great lesson.
So let's just trace the path of this wild journey we have been on today. We started with Eng wandering through the grocery store, falling victim to sensory fatigue, and a classic case of mistaken identity, assuming this highly complex torch ginger flower was just a standard decorative lotus bud.
And from there, we uncovered the hidden reality of Etlingera elatior, dissecting how its unique citrus, ginger, and herb profile acts as an invisible structural pillar to balance the extreme flavors of Southeast Asian dishes.
Right. We explored the unexpected economics of culinary staples, realizing that its incredibly low price point is exactly what democratized the ingredient and allowed it to become a cultural icon.
Oh, fairly.
We took a deep dive into the botany of the ginger family, marveling at the biological resilience of rhizomes acting as underground hard drives, all driven by the primal human urge to cultivate the things we find valuable.
And finally, we saw how Eng synthesized all of this vast information back into the immediate reality of Notes on Dieting, utilizing this newfound ingredient to inject novelty, collaboration, and the psychology of adventurous addition into a shared domestic routine.
It is astonishing how much insight is packed into just a few short paragraphs of a personal blog post. And, it brings this entire conversation right back to you listening to this right now.
Absolutely.
Think about your own local markets. Think about the aisles you speed down every single week. With your mental filters fully engaged, what are you completely ignoring?
What disguised lotus buds are you walking past?
Exactly. What disguised lotus buds are you walking past that are actually complex, structural, culinary superstars just waiting for you to read the label?
Our immediate environments are dense with untapped information, history, and potential that we simply train ourselves to overlook in the name of daily efficiency.
To wrap this up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that expands on everything we've explored today about this single fascinating plant.
Okay.
We talk extensively about the biological resilience of the rhizome, how it stores its own energy, how it can be violently divided and still aggressively establish a new independent plant in your backyard.
Right.
Contrast that with the fragility of our modern global grocery store system. We rely on heavily engineered, highly expensive, genetically uniform monocrops shipped across oceans, which can be wiped out by a single supply chain disruption or a shift in climate.
It's a very fragile system.
So, what if the ultimate lesson of the torched ginger flower isn't just about spicing up a Tuesday night diet? What if our future food security doesn't depend on inventing a new expensive supercrop in a corporate lab, but rather on rediscovering the rugged, decentralized resilience of the cheap native plants we've been blindly walking past for generations?
That's a powerful thought.
Plants so tough and abundant, all you need is a broken stem and a patch of dirt to start an agricultural revolution in your own backyard. It makes you wonder what else is hiding in the bargain produce bin.